Hey, this is Boaz. Thanks for showing up. Please visit the Fools and Sages podcast at foolsandsagespodcast.com. There are no spaces and it's all spelled out. You can find show notes, references, bios, merch, and other cool features. Contact us if you have feedback or a question, if you want to appear on the show, or if you want either or both of us to be a guest on your podcast. You can listen and subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, Rumble, Apple Podcasts, iHeart Podcasts, and anywhere else great podcasts are found. And follow us on X and Instagram. Support us on Patreon. The Patreon link's also in our website. And thank you. Enjoy the show. Morning, Brian.
Good morning, sir. How are you doing?
I'm well, thanks. How are you?
Oh, I'm doing good.
Good.
Just getting a little taking the edge off of the crisp morning, but we got
Uh-huh.
another sunny December day here.
Nice. Yeah, I miss it already.
Uh-huh.
Um, so we have been talking about how philosophy might be made practical for people, and how it also already plays a role in the individual and the collective psyche. And in a way, us having the conversations that we are about philosophy, psychology, religion are part of the evolution of our own consciousness and the collective consciousness itself. And we've also been talking a fair bit about modernism as kind of like an over rationalization of reality. And then coming behind that, a bunch of reactions to that:
Right.
psychological, philosophical, religious, shamanistic, even. And so we've kind of got this mix of interesting topics, I think, where us doing this podcast and coming up, we're going to have philosophy professors joining us, and we've got some interesting elements to throw in here. Us doing this podcast and having the kinds of conversations we are is in itself a reaction to the current state of collective psychology or
Mhm.
philosophy. And so I thought maybe let's try to kick that around a little bit, and why are we doing what we're doing? How does it fit into how we see the evolution of collective understanding, shared meaning, and what are the various maybe categories or elements of reactions to modernism that some of which are integrated into how we think about things and maybe some aren't. So there's a couple threads there. Maybe grab the one that grabs you first and let's see where we go.
Yeah. Well, it's kind of interesting. Due to the technology, obviously, we've been having a lot more uh, public exchanges. Public discourse has taken on a whole new chapter here, and which is fascinating to behold, honestly. Um, and part of this new paradigm shift that we're talking about. Um, and what I've been interested and somewhat enheartened by is that there have been more public discussions about philosophy and its implications and the assumptions that we take when we go out to build the world, whether it's our personal world or our collective world. And there has been, as part of that, a whole conversation about postmodernism, and I've heard all sorts of stuff back and forth. And my first question is, or my first reaction is, I'm not sure that there is a postmodernism. Uh, my sort of reading of the landscape is that there have been a lot of reactions to the ramifications of rationalism, as you mentioned. So just for our viewers to recall, we do have an episode out there that it's on its way out there um, about the role of America, about the American West, um, it does feel like America has a unique place in this conversation about postmodernism. And I think in a lot of ways, it's because America has been the flag holder for the march of modernism in many ways, uh, through technology, through economics, through a political philosophy. Um, and so we are kind of the ground zero in many ways for this conversation to wrestle with this problem.
You're saying that capitalism and industrialization are outcomes of a modernist worldview.
Right. And all technology, I think. I think the championing of science that we see is a postmodern or a post-enlightenment effect rather, not postmodern. And so when I think back to the times when I was born, society at large had not embraced any of the postmodern messages. And I've been starting on a special series of episodes for the channel and maybe for Patreon viewers, um, exploring I guess I have to put this backwards, exploring Walden by Henry David Thoreau. And Walden was really one of the first places where we started seeing philosophical content, and maybe Emerson before him. And Thoreau was certainly kind of coming out of Emerson's milieu there. But we started to see the first clues that maybe everything wasn't just rosy. If we go back in history, there was this explosion of technology, kind of like the one we just experienced, but in the 1800s. And so we had railroads. I mean, if you can imagine, you're going everywhere either on foot or by horse or carriage, and then all of a sudden, here is this thing. And I mean, just the massiveness of a railroad car, the way this bursts through the scene of life. All of a sudden now, things can travel fast and far, and the world is one big click smaller. And at the same time, we saw the first exposure to, like Thoreau refers to, the Bhagavad Gita and the Hindus and Native American culture and Native American values. And this is really kind of a new thing, and it's all very American. So, so what is the modernist problem? I think the modernist problem, uh, as I have slapped around Descartes before, uh, when he said, "I think, therefore I am," it seems simple, but what he did was he moved things into the first person. In other words, with his meditations and with his doubting everything except his direct experience, he really put the foundations under modern science. We're no longer going to be taking metaphysical assumptions and putting those underneath everything, and then using epistemology or reason based on evidence to arrive at our conclusions. And once that shift happened, we saw the explosion of science, and we saw the explosion of invention, and we saw the explosion of novelty. And I think that the human race was extremely optimistic about this. And I mean, new inventions and world expos, and look at all these new things. Uh, I think Thoreau says that now with the railroad, you can be whisked around the planet at a speed to kill old people. Was one of his conversations, right? So literally the world was like, wow, what's happening here? And then World War One happened, the Great War. And instead of horses and I mean, horses were still used, but instead of the old, swords and pistols, and all of a sudden we had mustard gas and we had trench warfare and we had just brutal, brutal suffering. And then, as if that wasn't enough, then we had this economic crash. and then another war, even more technological, even more dehumanizing, even more terrifying in terms of what has the human race wrought for itself here. And we see that in a number of different ways. That problem hasn't gone away, obviously. Now we're in a position where, I mean, we don't even trust the food that we're given to eat, and we're not sure that all this marvelous technology is feeding us anything but falsities and chimeras, right? So so we are really experiencing this crisis of modernism. Is this helping us or is it killing us? Is it bringing us to our future and our destiny, or is it going to just slaughter us wholesale? And uh, and that dilemma, of course, the Holocaust probably epitomized that because we saw a lack of humanity. And I'm not gonna say that that was new. If you remember, I told you the story of what happened to the killer of Brian Boru, where they cut him open and tied his intestines to a tree and made him walk around the tree. So it's not like cruelty itself was new, but I think the mechanized scale of it was new. The fact that all of this world-changing technology was put to the service of this inhumanity was just shocking to people. And immediately there was a sort of a metaphysical crisis. Who are we? What are we? What are we doing? And that set the stage for a host of postmodern reactions to that. And as I said, a lot of these things, and I've mentioned before that I think there's a theme through history of the elevation of the expression of individual experience. And so this is there also. We see it, in many of the postmodernist influences, a real focus on the primacy of the individual and individual experience and expression. And that, of course, showed up as Marxism. It showed up as I mean, I think it showed up as democracy in one respect.
I'm surprised you bring Marx into that because I guess my association with Marxism is very much collectivist, not individual.
Well,
And
Marx, he responded to what he called estranged labor, and it's that function of estrangement that has that modernist, mechanist imprint that I think he was reacting to, and I do think
meaning that
collectivization was.
an individual laborer is estranged because of their lack of relationship to the fruits of their labor.
They've become an economic unit, and they're no longer a human.
Yeah, yeah.
Productivity.
So having a reason to labor, the collective good, is of value to them as an individual,
And then
and
maybe a
there
psychological enfranchisement.
Mhm.
Because that estrangement really
Agency.
is a type of disenfranchisement, and I think we do see a lot of people now, the disenfranchisement of large numbers of people fuels a an emotional postmodern response, and I think that a lot of this is optics too, because, yes, we have seen individual human potential raised to a higher level, maybe, argument could be made, than we've ever seen before. And at the same time, we've seen dehumanization maybe in degrees we've never seen before. So
Mm.
the one of
So
those.
so let's go back a little bit. Um, if modernism is let's say an overemphasis on rationalism, right? Mechanization, science, etc. And the outcome of that is, say, the mechanization of warfare to a horrifying extent. Um, I guess I think of postmodernism, if it's a category of reactions, as maybe being looking for ways other than the rational or other than the objective to create meaning. Because I think I think the result of modernism could be described as tremendous progress in some ways and a loss of connection or a loss of meaning in other ways. And so
Mhm.
so is postmodernism asking the question, how might we find meaning, and not by rationalism and not by modernism?
I think to a degree, although a lot of the postmodernist critiques are very rational, uh, but it does have this problem of turning itself. And I think that there's also two distinct responses. One response, which we see, is like I've seen this meme where all the different the classic picture of the different stages of human development from, so one's Australopithecus, the next one's Cro-Magnon, the next one, and then finally you have modern man. And you've seen the meme where modern man is turned back and he says, "Go back. We made a we made a mistake." Right? So you have two schools. One school says we should go back because before we did all this, we had values, and those values were founded on metaphysics that had to do with our understanding of God and the humans and creation and where we stand in it. And therefore, we have a lot of oughts that are put upon us. By virtue of those metaphysics, we we can experience shoulds. We should treat our fellow men as equals, or with compassion. Or, but if we look in a purely mechanistic sense, we don't really see an argument for that. We see wolves eating rabbits and bears eating wolves, and we just see the face of nature. As Lao Tzu said, it's unkind. So where do we get a morality of kindness from if nature itself is unkind? And so, we can go back to the sages. Some folks might remember my conversation about Buddhism, that in Japan, they make a distinction between two flavors, you might say. In one, the characters are myself and power, and the other, the characters are trusting others. So if I'm in a structured reality that says that this is how the big metaphysical picture works, and here's my place in it, and therefore I should behave in so and such a way, that metaphysics has helped me move from what purely is to taking on an ought for myself. But as soon as this enlightenment happened and we became based purely on data, if you will, we have a hard time deriving morality from that. So some people say we should go back, other people say we need to move forward, that this is a stage, and that now instead of trusting others, we're in a place where every individual should be arriving at a moral foundation for themselves somehow.
It seems like going back would be a fool's errand. I mean, consciousness has changed. The you
I
know,
think the answer is both. Did you
and
just eat both pills? Leonard, did you just eat both pills? Because I do think, and that's the idea of the archaic revival. I think that we do need we do need some of the things that we were resting on from the old ways. And even Thoreau, where he bitches and moans about modern people, new ideas for new men, old ones for old, he says, and old people tell you that you can't do a thing and you try it and you find that you can. But he also wants to translate Homer, who's kind of old. And there's some rants in there where he talks about how people don't read good stuff anymore because they're just reading all this modern romance stuff that's just the monkey food, and they're not reading the classics. Even if it's in English, they don't read it. He, of course, was reading the Greek classics in the Greek. And so I do think that there is this archaic revival. I mean, I feel like my whole picture changed from this deep encounter with Native American traditions. And that gave me a firsthand way to experience things that I can get a should out of. I can experience an ought from my own personal experiences. But now other people either have to trust in others or find that experience for themselves. And the question then becomes, does our society steer us towards that or away from that? Does our culture value those things or degrade them?
It's interesting because I don't think of that as going back. I guess um, going back, I think of more as somehow forgetting rationality, and that's impossible, right? What you
Sure.
just described about Native American traditions, I think, is more integrating them with a modern or rational worldview,
Like the
and
tier
that sounds
two
like
idea.
a moving forward.
I think it is, but I think that it isn't the rejection of all things prior, which tends to happen on, on Wilbur's level 1, where modernism has to have a war against traditional, and postmodernism has to have a war, not just an intellectual war, but a very visceral, emotional war against modernism. And it's like, well, like as we get older and we look back, we have perspective that we didn't have. Say, well, maybe this negative thing happened to me, or this thing happened to me and it had negative ramifications, but it also had some positive ramifications. So I'm going to learn the good learning out of that. And I'm going to try to forget the gnashing of teeth part. And I'm going to take that and move forward into the future. So that, and this was some realizations for me because along with, for example, along with the ayahuasca tradition, within which came from the Native American traditions in South America, um, I also got a an appreciation and an understanding of traditional religion, which I was not particularly an adherent of.
Me too. Yeah.
But I understood devotional. I understood bhakti yoga and what devotional yoga was all about, and I understood that as applying to a Catholic person saying the rosary and lighting a candle in the church, and that was so foreign for me. So
I
that
don't know if it was because my teacher had a Russian Orthodox background, the person that I did a lot of ayahuasca ceremonies with. But I had experiences of various manifestations of Christ. Probably the most memorable for me was the crown of thorns, and like getting at a visceral level what dying for the sins of humanity meant, like what the ultimate sacrifice meant, and then Guadalupe, or various manifestations of the Blessed Virgin. And
right.
I'm Jewish, right? I don't have a direct relationship to these kinds of images, but um,
Oh, and I was raised Lutheran, and so for the Virgin Mary to show up as a force on the psychic levels, that was
right,
like a little aha.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So, so you mentioned that postmodernism had kind of two categories, going back and a going forward. And then you mentioned Thoreau specifically, but I know there's like a whole pantheon of trains of thought that elaborate various versions, say, of going back, going forward, or a combination thereof.
Right.
Maybe it would be helpful for our listeners to clarify what some of those trains might consist of.
Right. Well, I mean, I think we hear a lot. Well, depends on where you're listening, I suppose. But I've been hearing a lot about, uh, the philosopher who's the one that gets a lot of beat up quite a bit today is Jacques Derrida
Yeah, and
and
Foucault, or
Foucault. Yeah,
the Frankfurt School, they are?
yeah, and I mean, Derrida at least was influenced by phenomenology, which is kind of a postmodern or kind of a modern. I mean, I guess you could call it. I don't know. Phenomenology is very tied up with the first person experience. And
What is phenomenology?
well, I think, let's see, phenomenology, I believe, is attributed to Husserl. And, uh, when we got, when Descartes had this aha of I am, I think, therefore I am, there were a lot of there was that was just sort of the beginning of a bunch of chains of, well, therefore, and therefore, and therefore. And so, you had David Hume come in, who was not called a rationalist. I believe he was called an empiricist. And which is this idea of relying again on first person empirical knowledge. Look, the thing fell, or look, the thing rose, or and and he said, he kind of responds to Descartes, well, it's even worse than you thought because most of your thoughts are not even sound. So you saying I think, therefore, or something, but a lot of your thinking is kind of spurious. In fact, he was into this idea of impressed knowledge, that this knowledge came from the outside and the thoughts that are inspired from the outside, well, those are likely to be valid, but we can kind of go off in this fantasy world if we're not careful because thought we know can just be cut loose entirely, right? So
Like we were talking about in our last episode, there are all kinds of voices in our heads, and it takes some doing to sort them out and understand not only which ones are quote unquote useful, but a fair number of them are actively trying to derail us at any given time.
exactly,
So I think
exactly.
therefore I am has that problem too.
Well, like I think so. You had this reaction, and some people tried to save it. Like Kant, I think, tried to save it. And Kant's Critique of Pure Reason later influenced Emerson in the Transcendentalist school. They tried to save it by saying, "Well, we can we can get to this other place where we can make these other conclusions, like moral conclusions, by means of a faculty," was what he came out with, right? And and so and he got a lot of grief for that. And then Hegel came and said, "Well, what we really need is this rational dialogue that happens through history." I think it's important to realize that all these different philosophers, they're like they're they're plumbing for insights, and they'll get certain insights and then they'll build around that insight because they feel so strongly about that insight. So with Descartes, it was that I think, therefore I am thing. With Hegel, his insight, or one of his insights, was about this dialogue that happens intergenerationally through history, which is what we're taking part in now. Sometimes that gets called the great conversation. And we are going to have a conversation with a St. John's tutor, a PhD in the classics, to sort of look at some of these. And she's very much influenced by one of these writers that came out of that phenomenology, alongside of Derrida, who we don't call a phenomenologist, but his his analysis of things, I think, was largely linguistic, although the idea was that it would be applied to institutions and to, cultural values and things like that. But it really was much more insightful and responsible than the people nowadays who use him as an excuse for nonsense. And this is where there's a whole other conversation here that's another very American conversation by an American educational philosopher named John Dewey. And his school is called instrumentalism or experimentalism. And the idea is, again, we don't want to separate ourselves so far that we're inhabiting a purely intellectual space. We have to have hands on. So that's kind of speaks to the difference. Do we move from principle or do we move from an ideology? If we move from an ideology, then we've kind of lost that feedback with reality. And we find ourselves saying, well, people should behave this way according to my ideology. And then when they don't, we have a big problem. And and a lot of the solutions that we're seeing now are ideological. That the people want to put forth an ideological solution to modernism. And I think the American school, and I think Dewey, and other thinkers coming along, tend to imply that we need a more operational way of going about this. We need something that has more feedback with the matter itself. In other words, we need to take this upon ourselves like problem solving or troubleshooting, and not like building fanciful structures, intellectual structures in our head, and then berating people because their behavior doesn't fit with our ideological model of how they should behave. What if our ideological model is wrong or needs tweaking, or because it's divorced from experience, right? So that's where you had certain people like Marx, for example. He was, how do we solve this? How do we do this? How do we deal with this problem in practical terms? Well, we have a revolution. We get rid of the people who are liking things the way they are, because obviously they're, and then we pretty soon we get into a postmodern position where we say that, well, anybody trying to make any truth claims at all, they're just trying to put one over on me to repress me. It's like, well, honestly, though, I don't think that sages who have experiences that are extraordinary and they try to fill us in, I don't see that necessarily as oppression or repression. But a postmodernist does. In other words, I believe there is a role for teachers. I believe there is stuff that can be taken from the past. And if it leads you to a dead end, then you must have been interpreting it in a non-clear way. And but it doesn't mean that that we don't have the responsibility of making things fit and work in the here and now. And that's kind of been this, I think they call it pragmatism also, although that can go a lot of different ways. Um, but for me personally, what that translated to, because I did realize over time that my life, my responses and reactions to the world around me were very postmodern, in that there were things that I didn't want to participate. There were experiences that I know my parents had through, for example, their lifetime interactions with corporations. That's just one off the top. And I decided, well, I think that the way corporations operate is a little dehumanizing. So I think for my life, I don't want to base my essentials on a dehumanizing system. Uh, but then I also realized that I needed that first person experience. And that is definitely a postmodernist sensation. Okay, the priest may say this, and the sage may say this, and this is actually a Buddhist idea. There's a Buddhist sutra where he says, "Never believe a thing said merely because it's said, or because it seems to be a logical necessity, or because it seems like dakinis have inspired it, or because it was written in ancient tomes. But when you understand and see in your experience a thing to be true, only then act accordingly and abundantly," as I recall. And again, I'm paraphrasing that quote, but this is a first person assertion, right? This is your metaphysics will come from your realization. And so then what do I do to get that realization? That then becomes the next. But then once I've had that realization, now hopefully, I have an experience that I can base an ought on. An ought for myself, not an ought for other people. I may try to be persuasive about that, but I certainly can't do it by force of arms, right? And this is again, you're going to be good because I'm going to put you in a cage and only let good behavior pass. This doesn't work, right? So why? I want the person, this individual unit, to operate within the structures of my ideology. It's like, well, humans operate under the structure of their own psychology, not necessarily so much your ideology. And read Solzhenitsyn if you want to see this, all the T's crossed and all the I's dotted, and all and he also is a reaction to this modernist, because remember when we talked before in our episode about Western philosophy, we talked about the thing that came out of Hegel was this idea that, well, we're going to use reason, and reason is obvious, and makes things clear because of logic and evidence. And therefore, everybody eventually is going to get on the same page because reason is just reason and will only allow for one conclusion. And therefore, we can all be on the same page and we're all going to wear the same uniform. We're all going to march and we're all going to do the same salutes. And you can see where we go here, right? Boom, 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 boom. Then all of a sudden, we're Sieg Heil, right? And uh, so, you know, what I found in my exploration and my delves into psychology is that reason is a complete whore. Reason will serve whatever the psychological predisposition is. You know, this is kind of like the famous prosecutor who said, "You show me the guy, I'll find you the crime." Right? Reason works based on whatever our predisposition wants us to look, right? And to the conclusion we want to have. Now, there are some people that are very religious about reason and they'll argue hoof and nail, but history is replete with examples of this, right? Go with a court case, go to a court case. Both sides are very reasonable. If you're listening to two good lawyers argue, you listen to the first one and you go, "Oh yeah, he's right. He's definitely right." And then you listen to the second one, you go, "Oh no, he's definitely right." Right? And if they're good, it should go that way for a while before finally something is revealed, right? But reason, reason is not necessarily wisdom. And,
Um,
and
that's sticking with me a little bit, because the way I'm interpreting what you're saying about reason is that because of our pre-existing biases and filters and the fallacies that we're prone to, reason ends up distorted, or
yeah,
or a tool for the distortion of what's really going on. And so my reaction to that is, well, can we get rid of biases and logical fallacies and filters and all of that stuff so that reason can actually um, b- be illuminated and illuminate whatever it is that we're trying to get clear on.
right.
And
But will we
and I
do
think
that
that's
by
what the
reason or
scientific
by
method is
some
intending to do.
right, by reason? And I would claim that the way these biases affect us is through the suppressed premises, and
Uh,
so that it becomes very difficult for the flashlight to shine back on itself.
Say more about suppressed premises.
Well, we make certain assumptions, this is the problem with reasonable systems, is that they're always based on something, and, this is one of the things that geometry is used for in the classics to demonstrate. We have to have definitions. We have to make certain assumptions. And there are whole schools of mathematics now that say, well, if we change this assumption, then we get this entirely logically coherent system, but it's very different because it was based on this other assumption. I don't think you can ever prove your assumptions. I think that's a logical problem. So that while it seems very reasonable to say, well, we can turn reason onto our use of reason and that will solve the problem, and I think it will solve some of the simpler problems, but I think that it's a fool's errand because we will ultimately get to those assumptions.
Well, take something like gravity, for example. Um, it seems like the assumptions have mostly probably been driven out of our understanding of how gravity works. No?
I'm not sure about that. I'm sure there are people that are still arguing about aspects of that, but if we move from gravity instead and we make the human soul the topic, what does reason have to say for us there?
Nothing.
Well, it does have some things to say, provided we allow the assumptions.
Like there
Which
is
would
such a thing as a soul.
which would be a religious assumption,
Right.
right? And so then what is that assumption based on? So my feeling is that, yes, you can antidote reason, but not with reason, not with more reason. I think that's a very slippery fish.
But what I think you're saying is that when it comes to questions of meaning, questions of why, we need our assumptions to play in the game. but when we're asking questions of how, w- tell me more about why it's not sufficient to drive our assumptions out of the equation of how. Like why? Um,
Well, I think that like Einstein said, reason is a good tool. It's a useful tool, but it can't address the assumptions that we might call metaphysical assumptions.
I guess where I'm getting stuck, and we can move on if I'm just not getting it, is that I guess I see value in processes that continually attempt to drive out assumptions, and I see value in processes um, that uh, that have to include assumptions because they're processes related to meaning as opposed to
Right.
fact. Say,
Sure. Sure. But so the question is, what do you do? What experience is necessary for your reason to operate beyond bias? And is that a reasonable experience or is it a spiritual experience? And I would argue that it's an actual metaphysical experience that's required,
so
that the ancients used the mysteries for, perhaps.
can't I? Okay, this is maybe getting dumb for me, sorry.
No, no, no.
But can't I, continue designing experiments that, um, that drive assumptions out or that illuminate assumptions, um, as opposed to trying to eliminate assumptions in my own psyche?
Oh, I don't think you eliminate assumptions. I think you just don't arrive at your assumptions by reason or by happenstance. You have to arrive at your those logical assumptions based on an experience, and that's where I think it's based on an extra. See, here's the way that I came upon this. uh, I wrote a paper years ago called the limitations of logic. And the argument that I made was based on science. And that was that when we got into the science of black holes or beams of light or things moving at the speed of light or things that were super small, we found that regular logic didn't work. For example, with the speed of light, there's a famous experiment where we measure the speed of light from A to B and we get a value. And then we take B and we move it towards A at 1,000 miles an hour. So logically, the measured speed should be the speed of light minus 1,000 miles an hour, right? It's not. It's the speed of light. When we move the target away from the source at 1,000 miles an hour and we measure the speed, should be 1,000 more, right? It's not. It's the speed of light because we're outside of what physicists refer to as the zone of middle dimensions. So the idea becomes that when we get into these quantum realities or we get outside of the zone of middle dimensions, what makes sense changes. Sense itself changes.
I dig that.
So how do I think about God then with this reason that worked with Newtonian physics? How do I think about the ultimate destiny of the soul or identity with the same logic that applied to whether something falls off the table or not, to all the easy stuff inside of the zone of middle dimensions. And this, I think, later on when we have this conversation about Levinas, he'll get into that because this is an interesting branch of the phenomenological tree that moves from first person experience as primary to second person experience, not I but thou, kind of revolutionary in its own way. But so I mean the question becomes what when I want wisdom and I want to make choice and I want to refer to something for choice, if I just use pure reason and everyday assumptions, how do I not end up on the Third Reich? At the Third Reich? Well, the answer is because I have to have this sensation. I mean, Meno, can virtue be taught? I have to have values that take me beyond just the unkind level of inanimate ping pong ball objects. Where do I get that from? And what do I base it on? I can trust other people that say, oh, if you don't operate with this morality, if you don't respect this ought, then you're just going to go to hell. Well, what's that? Well, here's this whole thing, right? Or uh, I have my own experience and I come to a conclusion that says that I operate this way because this is my understanding, this is my experience of the premises. These are the assumptions that I've made based on my personal experience that says that I shouldn't treat other humans like inanimate objects. Not because Jesus said so, right? Because as Nietzsche told us, God is dead. So that means it's on us. Uh, eh, so so where do I get that experience? I think that that's what that's why there was a tradition in the modern West to look towards psychedelics. I think that was part of it. I think that this is not new. I think that this is perhaps I've read some very interesting arguments taken from some Greek things that have just recently been translated that you don't hear about that seems to imply that maybe the mysteries, as they were called, did involve non-ordinary states of consciousness, generated through plant medicines of some kind or other. Um, so, and I think, from the experiences that I've had, I have no question. I have a type of certainty that logic based on unexplored premises will never render. But those are also absolutely subjective. So I can't necessarily argue them because then I'm back into reason and we have to have the same assumptions. We have to make the same rest on the same premises. So I have two choices. I can say, well, you got to trust me, or I can say, here, do this. Tell me what you think.
Drink this.
Yeah.
Um,
Oddly, we often come to an intersubjective agreement, uh, which is a whole other topic. What is this intersubjective idea? It's
uh,
not objective. It's not subjective. What is it?
um, well, I mean, I'm curious to hear you answer that. And I'm curious also to go back to something you said about many of the postmodern critiques being quite rational, because I'm having trouble squaring that with where we landed now
Right.
relative to assumptions
Well,
being.
like, for example, one of the things that and I am not an expert on Derrida, and I know less about Foucault, but I know they're both not considered easy as far as philosophical reading is concerned, and some parts, I know of Derrida are considered quite difficult, as a lot of phenomenologists are, okay? And this is because and this gets into something I wanna talk with the St. John's tutor about, and that is the role of language in all this. And we find out that philosophers, they don't use words the way the rest of us use words. When they say being, they might mean something different. When they say throne, they might mean something different. When they say authentic, they might mean, all these are terms that phenomenologists have very specific definitions for. And so there's a whole role of language and how does language help us get there or not? And Derrida was looking at that. So, for example, we talked in one of our earlier conversations about the philosophical device of yin and yang. And we notice if we explore that yin and yang thing, we see that it's actually not just a fabric, not just in the fabric of things, but it's also in the fabric of language. So when I say this, it might seem like I just said this, but I also said not all these not thises. So again, there was the yin and yang machine just for me to say something. Well, one of the things that I think Derrida gets into is he says, well, sometimes we get blinded to the nature of reality by the nature of language. And that some of these philosophical machines get running without us turning them on. And they start popping out conclusions. Because remember, I said in the beginning that a philosophical machine has to be applied correctly. You got to push the right buttons and turn the right wheels, and or else you get a false conclusion. And that's kind of what Derrida was pointing to. And he's not wrong. Of course. Of course. My experience, though, has been when I listen to the people in the postmodernist mob, I think very few of them have actually read Derrida, and even less of them understood what they read. What my meter tells me is that, and this is what it's coming back, circling back again. If I have an emotional predisposition, I will choose something that rationalizes that. It doesn't That's not the product of deep introspection. That's the product of I have an emotion and I want to validate it I want to validate my behavior based on that emotion. And so I'm going to pile some stuff up under it to give it an excuse. And so I don't suggest that people use excuses that they can't understand thoroughly. And I think that's what's happening with Derrida and with Foucault. And I think that's what's happening with a lot of their critics now. I
So
don't
so
think that their critics are responsibly reading them either.
I've heard Jordan Peterson criticize Foucault and Derrida,
Yeah, he loves to.
um, and I I can't, uh, you know, I, I I I think it would be arrogant for me to summarize his critique, or to pretend I understand it comprehensively. But what I do understand is that he gives them credit for understanding that human beings process information through narratives as opposed to facts
Mhm,
or discrete words, and that narratives allow us to prioritize, and that there's
mhm.
a massive amount of prioritization going on 24/7 when we're intaking information and categorizing it and reacting to it, etc.
Yep,
So he
yep,
says they got that right,
yep.
and then what they got wrong is that the prioritization mechanism is all about power. Um,
Mm,
and I haven't read Foucault or Derrida enough. In fact, I don't know if I've read them at all. I've listened to Foucault. There are some interesting
mhm,
YouTube videos. There's one
mhm,
of him discussing the nature of reality with Chomsky that I thought was kind of interesting.
mhm.
Um, but I'm not an expert on Foucault. What I can see is that in wokeism, and in Marxism, this idea that power is the arbiter of, um, or power is the fundamental thing people are struggling with, and by looking at so-called structures in society through the lens of power, we we realize these structural setups that are oppressing some people and privileging others, etc. Which which I would agree with Peterson is a really destructive way of thinking about effective society. I don't know Derrida and Foucault enough to comment on whether he's reading them correctly, but I see in
Yep,
Black Lives Matter and
sure.
in
Yep,
gender ideology and in various places, and anti-Semitism, in a huge way, especially in the last year, this like obsession with oppressed and oppressor as a
right,
dichotomy, um,
right.
that we
Well,
use
and
to divide people.
that's what's ironic, and I'm not an expert in Derrida or Foucault, but that's what's ironic about the whole thing, and that particularly, I know Derrida had this thing about what I would call the misapplication of yin and yang, and But it seems to me that if you grasp those things as a bright person would, and Derrida was clearly bright, uh, the last thing you come away with is othering other people, because that's a yin and yang machine that's doing work it's not needed to do, right? That's a misapplication of that dynamic. So, and that's all that I see out of popular so-called, I'll even call it pseudo postmodernism, because it's not an insightful enough critique. In fact, it undoes in many ways, it strawmans postmodernism.
And yet it's playing a tremendous role in the public discourse. So it is a school, right?
I'm not
Like it or
sure
not.
that it is. I have a feeling that it's only a reference, that most of the people using it haven't even read it or understood it.
Sure. But is
They've read
isn't
a textbook about it, I bet,
but
and they've
isn't
listened to a
wokeism the
professor
true
talk about it.
isn't wokeism, since it shows up in society to the extent that it does, the true reaction to modernism? Or at least
Yeah, but I
a
don't I
true
but it's
one?
not it doesn't do justice to the postmodern critique.
Sure.
In other words, there are some I don't wanna see the baby go out with the bathwater here. And if you make super ridiculous arguments and you demonstrate a emotional dysregulation as part of that argument, you're playing for the other team, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Like, you're
I get
making that whole line of critique seem frigging ridiculous. And the fact is that there are some real problems with modernism that postmodernism does need to address, or that people in the postmodern era do need to address.
Yeah, I guess I'm just saying if the logical outcome of modernism is the Third Reich, then perhaps the logical outcome of postmodernism is um, uh, oppressed, oppressor, um, uh, dichotomies running rampant through society, intersectionality.
Right,
Yeah.
right, right. I just don't call that a valid postmodernist critique. Uh, I see it as an emotional reaction that gets fed emotionally, not intellectually. So that my meter says colder, 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 colder,
Hmm.
right? Uh, and now if you were I mean, the way that I would fight modernism is with experience, not with rhetoric.
Hmm.
Whether it's first person experience like discourse, or first person experience like a shamanic experience, uh, I don't really, it's like it's like it's an argument that John Dewey makes, and he says that you don't teach somebody the theory and then you get them into practice. You get them to experience the practice a little bit, and then you give them the theory. But if they don't have any experience in the practice, then that theory is completely disembodied from reality. So that theoretical knowledge has to go with practice. It must have praxis with it, or it's danger to be just swept away into an unreality. And and I think this is another one of those cases where it's like, well, let's look at what you're doing. DEI came out of this postmodernist thing, right? Well, let's look at what it's doing. That's the difference between a pragmatist approach and an ideological approach. Problem with ideology, if it's not practiced, is it means that any idiot can pick it up, misunderstand it, and apply it willy-nilly however they want. If it's grounded in practice, you see the cart run off the track. You say, well, whatever it is, whether if this ideology was based on real insight, then we've screwed it up somehow because the cart keeps going off the track. And that's why I say this is more like akin to troubleshooting or problem solving. And that is you do something, then you watch, and then you adapt what you do based on what you see. And if that was at work in the current DEI world, we would know it, and it's not. And that's why the research says that we teach these people DEI and they come out hating each other worse than they went in. Well, that's That's one of those red lights on the meter that says this is probably not the way. Yeah, but it's the application of ideology, not principle.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of DEI, I think Elon posted something today. I think it was NIH was up to 27% of its spending on DEI. Yeah,
Wow.
27%. So that's, I mean, that's the praxis, right? That's what's
Right.
happening in real life, as opposed to whatever the ideology says it's trying to do.
And it's getting a lot of feedback. And this recent election was part of it also. And the pushback against wokeism is where I think that a lot of the people that I see that are the biggest mouthpieces for this, they don't understand the difference between an ideology and operating on a principle.
Yeah.
And because I spent years as a plumber, right? I know that your ideas about things are only so valuable. Either the water leaks out or it doesn't. Either the pump gets it up the hill or it doesn't. And often we have models, cognitive models that we've made from experience, and they're wrong. And if you're working with a system like a reality based system, like a water system, well, either the water's filling up the tank or it's spilling down the road. You can't argue that. There's no ideological excuse for why water running down the road is actually better than the water being in the tank. It's insane, right? But as soon as we get these things, when we start dealing with things that are less tangible or less obvious, or we stop experiencing the thing firsthand and we start going into our mental model and we say, well, it should be this, it should be that, because yada, 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 yada. If we stop experiencing the reality, then we're going to go astray. We're going to gang aft agly.
Well, it seems that the puzzle here of like going into first person experience, and given that it's subjective, is how do we surface the assumptions in that first person experience, or can we, so that they're integratable as opposed to having whatever subjective experiences spin us off in every possible direction, or what
Right,
disciplines
right.
might exist
Yeah.
that present some guardrails on the subjective experience, or I guess I'm not sure how to think about that even.
Psychology, psychotherapy, shamanic practice. If you have as an assumption, as a premise to your system that people don't treat me right, and you derive that based on some personal history, that becomes a premise in your logical system. When you're trying to explain other people's behavior, when you're trying to predict your future behavior, when you're trying to understand past or future interactions, if the logic system is always based on, well, people don't treat me fairly, then that's going to become part of the reasoning system. That becomes a postulate. Okay, I think that's one of the things that psychotherapy reveals to us is that we're carrying around postulates that are unproven, or maybe they're only anecdotally proven, and maybe they don't serve us. Then there's a whole topic of it might be useful to have some models that aren't true, but they're really powerful and useful. Like when I was training kids to do particular stepping in kung fu, we'd put marks on the ground and we'd say, okay, those are the rocks. Everywhere else is lava. So now when you're jumping through and you're doing your step behind and you're doing your jump, you got to land on the rocks. There's no lava there. Still helps though. Why? Because they can put lava in their cognitive model and they can make those uh, masking tape circles on the floor into stones. And they'll actually improve their process with that model. And it's not true, but it's useful. But works the same way also. We have a lot of maybe untrue models that aren't useful. And those become ways that our processing gets tweaked and biased and prejudiced. And so this is, come back to Plato's Academy, know thyself. And And I do think that there are fascinating things. This is where therapy, this is where, like, when we talk about Levinas and the experience of the other, we talked about the challenges of that in one of our previous episodes, I think, on politics and the other. But we haven't really explored this idea of othering or uh I mean, I guess we have a little bit when we talked about the boundaries, the idea of these movable boundaries. And when we move a boundary between ourselves and another person, we've othered them based on
Yeah,
whatever.
and I think we've talked about it in terms of the benefits of interacting interdependently, right? And that's
Right.
another.
Right.
That's not othering. It's kind of acknowledging the
Yeah. Yeah.
opportunities of being in relationship. Yeah,
Yeah. The vicissitudes and the troubles.
yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So anyway, that's kind of what we're in the midst now, and we see people when you see a widespread disaffection for the major institutions of society. That's all part of this postmodern milieu because a lot of these institutions are modern institutions
You know
and
what's
they're
weird?
operating in modern ways.
I hadn't. I'm not aware of having seriously read any postmodern thought. But I remember telling. I was having some political conversation with my adopted father, and I always kind of want to butt heads with him when we talk about politics. And I remember saying something like, "The United States is fundamentally uh, racist. It's um, unredeemable. The whole thing needs to be torn down, and we have to start over." And I and now I'm hearing this like on the news, right? Today, here and now, I'm hearing
Uh-huh.
like that's coming from everywhere, and for me, that was like in hindsight, just clearly an act of rebellion. It wasn't thought through at all. I wasn't considering like um, all kinds of um, uh, assumptions that were baked into
Right.
that very strong statement. And
Mhm.
so, all this to say is that um, the the semantic reality that we experience and the extent to which it's influenced by ideas that are just hanging out in the ether around us, you know, like it seemed like I had come up with that myself, but clearly it was something that was happening in
The
general at
zeitgeist.
scale in reaction to,
Exactly.
yeah,
Yep.
and I
No,
was
I had
just a
similar
node.
realizations to that. But my solutions became different. And like I said, a lot of it was I was impacted at an early age by Thoreau and having read that. And
I would say my solutions keep getting different, like, they keep changing.
oh, uh-huh.
Um,
Mhm.
where yeah, I
Well, I
kind
think
of
it was the direction that I got from Thoreau, more than the specifics.
mhm, yeah.
And I think that a lot of this postmodern age is a direction. And, I used to work with the state, and I had on one occasion, the guy with the state, he wanted me to drive all the way down an hour so that I could put a hashtag in front of a number on an address and then drive an hour back because, the system wouldn't allow him to put the hashtag. He's looking at 2 addresses, 28 Main Street, hashtag 28 Main Street. This is a big problem. We have to solve this. And I said on the phone, I said, no, I'm not going to do this because I'm not that stupid and neither are you. But the system is that stupid. Well, that was a modern problem. You're gonna go through this clearly ridiculous when you put it in those terms. I'm gonna burn 2 hours of fossil fuel. I'm gonna move 3 tons of material 120 miles. I'm going to take 2 hours out of my day to put two tiny little horizontal lines and two tiny little vertical lines on a piece of paper. Right. Well, now at some point, any human has to reject this. they have to say there's no way that this is the way forward.
So crippling bureaucracy being an outcome of modernism is interesting also. Um,
Mhm,
Not just the Third Reich. Uh, and I think part of the energy that we see around the Trump administration and Musk and Ramaswamy getting involved with the Department of Government Efficiency and RFK Jr. getting involved with whatever "Make America Healthy Again" might mean,
mhm,
is all kind of a reaction to bureaucracy run amok, and probably corruption along with it, but at least
mhm,
bureaucracy.
mhm.
And so that's interesting because I haven't thought of Trump as postmodern in that way. But in this context, it like certainly he's not rational, right?
Well, I don't think anybody in that game is rational. In fact, I had a theory about that. It's Brian Lee's theory of bullshit. And that is that half the time we hear a politician talk bullshit, we're going, "Oh, don't worry about it, that's just bullshit." And the other half of the time we hear him talking bullshit, we're kind of like, uh well, I suppose the other time we're, like, hoping it's not bullshit, right? But so then my thought is that maybe those 2 bullshits cancel out, and maybe that's the genius of bullshit, the way politicians use it. You say something that's clearly bullshit, like I didn't believe for a minute that that Biden wasn't gonna give a pardon to his son, right? The current one. I just found that untenable, right?
Sure.
Uh, but, so I heard it's like, "Oh, clearly that's bullshit." But the people who wanted to think that was right, it's like, "Oh, that's not bullshit," right? But say something else, maybe then they'll go, "Oh, well, don't worry about that. They just say that because politicians say." So that way, you get the largest group of people behind your bullshit, and you get at the same time license to not have to worry about what you say, right? And this is like people are now they're shocked and they're amazed that Biden lied about what he was going to do, but they all knew that he plagiarized people in college.
But that exactly strikes me as postmodern. I mean, and maybe I'm hanging on to this a little too tightly, but where our expectations of what truth is and how truth gets conveyed and whether truth is important and all of that stuff have become completely subjective, where we refer to truth or not based on how it serves our purposes. And to that end, maybe Peterson's critique is over the target because your examples just now seem very much to be about power.
Oh yeah, it's I just don't think that it's a valid postmodernist critique per se.
Yeah, it's not
Um,
going to
yeah,
work to build
right.
a
It's not
better
going to work. That's the
society.
real
Right.
that's the real point.
Right.
But it's certainly inspired by a real thing
It's happening.
and that's happening. And I don't think we can let that go out of the out with the bathwater.
Yeah.
Yeah. But so it's interesting to see us muddle our way through this. Uh, because of the way it impacts everybody's self-interest one way or the other, and it translates there one way or the other. That's why this assassination now in New York City pretty interesting because it's you could see it as not the assassination itself, but look at the public's reaction to the assassination, and you see, I mean, it's all inspired by that reaction to this modernism that is dehumanizing people.
You're talking about the United Healthcare CEO.
Yeah.
So I've seen some
Who
reaction.
showed a profit of $450 billion and was turning people down for medical care who had paid their insurance premiums based on a certain understanding of their contractual agreement. So now the relative truth thing It's like, well, it was a contract, a valid contract when you were paying us the money, but when it comes for us to do what we contractually agreed to do, maybe we'll change our mind about that. Well, now, so you're gonna get some reactions to people from that. They say, "Well, the truth of my relative dying for lack of medical care, there's nothing relative about that. That was as real as ever gonna get." And so you can try to get all postmoderny and say, "Well, that isn't really real, but for that family, it's really real." And somebody maybe somehow, and again, we don't know what happened, but looking at the public's reaction, we certainly know what they feel could have happened, or maybe even some of them wanted to happen. So that's kind of revealing of the zeitgeist, right? The time ghost, the spirit of the times. Uh, and I interestingly heard someone say that they were a pharmacist and that frequently during the day when people would come to get their meds paid for by insurance, they would get turned down. And they said that surprisingly today, no prescriptions got turned down. I thought, "What is that true? Is that
That
really
can't be true.
true?"
There's no way
But it
the
make
system adjusted that quickly.
but it yeah, but it tells you though that there is maybe a listening on the other side that says that maybe we're heading for a cliff with the way we're doing things, even though it looks like it's working so good for us. Maybe the holistic system isn't supporting it just because it's working so good for us. And this is the story through history, right? This is how what precedes many head choppings often in history. So, yeah, interesting times. And it's hard to see something in the news now that isn't related to this sort of philosophical conflict that's happening. It seems like it's about sports, or it seems like it's about economics, or it seems like it's about international policy or something. But really, it always drills down to this core issue, and that kind of speaks to the role of philosophy.
Name that issue again. The core issue.
Well, this uh, 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 has our hyper materialistic, rationalistic way lost all human values?
Got it.
And therefore, is it now all turds and no punch left in the punch bowl? If we imagine a turd to punch ratio,
Mm.
how has that ratio gone? And at some point, people start pushing back from the table, you know. And we just saw so many things to cause so much to intensify this. The reaction to COVID, a lot of the things that are coming out now that are being revealed as having been covered up, and profit motives and political shenanigans and all these sorts of things. Well, this is all still that same. Have we created a machine that doesn't care for us? With all those different implications of care, take care of us or care much for us,
Mhm.
like us much, and when you hear people concerned about population control programs, that's sort of an indication that people aren't really feeling like they're being taken care of by these institutions that they create and support. So,
Yeah, and the movement towards assisted suicide as a medical intervention. And yeah, I mean, it really, as you said, right? It's hard to see a news story once you have this model of is have we built a humane system or not is present. It's hard not to see everything as an expression of that
yeah,
model. Yeah.
yeah, or that conflict,
Hmm.
yeah, with a lot of people crushed under the wheel. So that's interesting to see too. But I think that there may be a function that now we're globe, like something happens on the other side of the world, we know about it. If someone deems it significant, and it can be anybody deeming it anybody with a smartphone can deem it significant, and we'll all find out about it. And so so we might understand these things in in a more unified way now. Like it might make the issue starker. because of this effect of becoming one world. So that may drop the microscope on it.
Certainly will have an effect. I don't
Yeah.
know that I would predict what that is exactly,
Yeah.
because, at the same time, drowning in the quantity of information out there, and the unreliability of information, which might
Mhm.
not be any different than it's been in the past, but it's at a higher volume.
Maybe. Yeah.
Those are part of that equation too. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, yeah,
I think of the 100th monkey a lot when I think about this. And I'm wondering about, we only need so many of the monkeys to get on the page here before it seems osmotically to transfer to the gang at large. So so I'm hopeful for that. And I do think that there are people that are learning how to use these new technologies for the right things, to move things in the right direction. As well as there are many who are still doing the old things with the new tools, which is
yeah.
a human thing. Yeah.
Well, maybe actually technology is maybe a topic for us to circle back to on another episode. There's some interesting threads there.
Yeah.
But as far as today is concerned, I think probably we should put a pin in this one
Yep.
and call it a day and come back to some of these topics next time.
Yeah. And I want to point out that, we've opened up different windows onto this conversation. And in the upcoming weeks and months here, we're gonna be talking with a bunch of people that are gonna help paint a lot of the leaves onto those trees to help us understand in more detail and gain some perspective from their viewpoints, having gone way into detail more than we have in some of these areas. So, particularly, I think that we're gonna be having some conversations about ethics, which is how do we treat one another? How do we build a world together? All these things is really relevant now, and so I think those. I'm really looking forward to the way we'll be able to think about these things after we've had all these conversations.
Yeah, me too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very exciting. And I think that's another interesting thing about this is, we've been having these conversations, and part of the thing about dialectic is you don't know where it's going to end up because you're encountering the other person, and the other person is always an unknown. And so I feel like the threads that the direction that all of our episodes have gone, I couldn't quite have predicted. Uh, but that it is sort of steering into things that are kind of in common with us all now, that are sort of relevant and timely, and that we all could spare a little time to think about and understand how we play into it and its effects on us. So hopefully that influence is going to help us all become, what's the term here? Hoopy froods. Have you ever heard that?
Yeah.
Well, we all strive to be hoopy froods. Uh, you can figure that out. You can Google that to get all the details. It comes from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Douglas
Oh, I
Adams.
should know it then. It's
Yep,
been a while, but those
yep.
yeah.
And if you're really a frood, then you're a hoopy frood. And I mean, because you'll have your towel right there. Hoopy froods always have their towels. And on that note, we should probably finish it.
All right, Brian.
Okay, all you hoopy froods.